7th Durban Forum. So if you could kindly take your places. So maybe close the door. Okay, so shall we? Okay. Shall we? Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Without further ado, we'll now start the work of the 7th Durban Forum. Would like to introduce and give the floor to Mr. Emmanuel Lamini, who is the chair of the SBI and chair of the Durban Forum Capacity Building. Please, the floor is yours, Chair.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I'm trying to see if I can be comfortable in the chairs. Normally, you find that you have a table, but it's a good invention. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 7th Durban Forum, which brings us all together today, parties, representatives of the constituent bodies under the Convention, its Kyoto Protocol, and experts and practitioners. Our common interest is to contribute to an informed and insightful exchange on the theme of this year's meeting, which is enhancing capacities for the implementation of nationally determined contributions in the context of the Paris Agreement. The long-term goal of the Paris Agreement will only come to fruition through the effective implementation of the NDCs. NDCs embody the efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and introduce successful adaptation measures. But how to ensure that countries have the necessary capacity to effectively implement the NDC is a big question. Where are the key capacity gaps and bottlenecks, and how can solutions and best practice be scaled up? It's another question. To try to answer these and other questions, we have gathered here today. The organization of this year's meeting took into consideration the request by the COP to align the theme of this 7th forum with the 2017-2018 focus area of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. The lessons learned and outcome of this forum here today are therefore expected to directly feed into and inform the work of the PCCB. The three subtopics selected today draw on many submissions by parties and observers received in response to call of the SBI at this last session. These submissions proposed concrete subtopic aligned with the PCCB focal area. And I believe that these three subtopics selected for today's event are all highly relevant and provide a direct link to the rolling work plan of the PCCB. The subtopics as selected are as follows: enhancing institutional, technical, relational, and strategic capacities for NDC implementation. Building capacities for integrating cross-cutting issues such as gender, responsiveness, human rights, indigenous peoples' knowledge into NDC implementation. And the third one, building capacities for the tracking of and reporting on the implementation and impacts on NDC-related actions and the finance used to support these actions. Let me share with you that I am delighted about the new mandate for the COP to closely link the Durban Forum with the work of the PCCB, because not only will this create synergies and greater coherency, but it will also help us increase the impact of the Durban Forum and the dissemination of its outcome. The second meeting of the PCCB has started this morning and will continue until Sunday. Ms. Rita Misham from Guatemala and one of our two distinguished co-facilitators today is a member of the PCCB and will report on the outcomes of the 7th Durban Forum at the PCCB meeting tomorrow. The PCCB will then take stock of these outcomes to identify and agree on concrete actions points to follow up on and address the challenges and capacity gaps that will be identified here today. Our second facilitator is Ms. Russell Miles from Australia. Russell is leading the mechanism and adaptation session in the Sustainability and Climate Change branch of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia, and is also a member of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. You're welcome, sir. It is my great pleasure to welcome them both on this podium, as I am sure that they will provide the necessary guidance and enabling environment to allow for an open, fruitful, and enlightening exchange of views, experiences, and ideas. Rita, you're also welcome. I therefore now would like to give Rita and Russell the floor to continue with the meeting. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dlamini. I would like to thank SBI Chair Emmanuel Dlamini for chairing the forum and for the warm welcome and excellent remarks provided. As a co-facilitator of the 7th Durban Forum on Capacity Building, I would once like to welcome you all to the forum, and I look forward to a lively and productive discussion on the topic of enhancing capacities for the implementation of NDCs in the context of the Paris Agreement. As a member of the PCCB, I can only fully second the views expressed by Mr. Dlamini on the important link between the Durban Forum and the work of the PCCB. It's on.
It's on. Thank you, Rita, and thank you, Chair. We very much appreciate your time today when we know that you have a very busy schedule, and thank you for helping us open this session. I think in the spirit of the full and active participation that we are continuing to look for ways to enhance during this session, just like to remind everybody that the Durban Forum on Capacity Building is an open event. And anyone can participate in discussions, and we actually encourage everyone to participate in the discussion. It is a really important place for us to hear your views, the perspectives of parties and non-party stakeholders, experts, as well as the capacity building recipients and the capacity builders. The key inputs and interventions made by the resource people and the audience today will be captured in a summary report by our excellent secretariat, which will be submitted to the SBI for consideration at its 49th session. The 7th Durban Forum is being broadcast on Skype, and the link to the live streaming of the event is provided on the Durban Forum webpage, and which is on your screen. I would encourage you to send that link out to your followers and to your delegations and to your friends, and get them to engage with us online, as that's a really important part of the work we're trying to do to increase participation in the forum.
And speaking of the Durban Forum webpage, this is where you can get all the information about today's program and resources useful for today's discussion. This includes the most recent compilation and synthesis papers on the capacity building work of bodies established under the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, as well as on the implementation of the capacity building framework in developing countries, which have been prepared by the UNFCCC Secretariat.
Now we all spend a lot of time sitting down in this forum over the two weeks. So our program today has been designed with the objective of providing lots of room for interaction and for standing up and mingling and talking. So one of the three main topics to be discussed at the forum today is enhancing institutional, technical, relational and strategic capacities for NDC implementation. In many countries, additional capacity will need to be built to support the NDC implementation, including capacities for governance and coordination, modelling and evaluation, for building and maintaining partnerships, and for systematic policy design and implementation. We'd like to invite everybody attending today to share your experiences with capacity building support provided and received, and to identify the remaining gaps and bottlenecks that you see are important, and to discuss the solutions and good practices and how they can be scaled up. During today's program, we will, for example, hear about the experiences made by Indonesia in implementing its NDC, and about the progress made by global and regional coordination initiatives like the NDC partnerships.
Building capacities for integrating cross-cutting issues such as gender responsiveness, human rights, and indigenous peoples' knowledge into NDC's implementation is the second major subtopic to be addressed in this forum. As well as we all know, climate change has a greater impact on those sections of the population that are most reliant on natural resources and ecosystems for their livelihoods, and who have the least capacity to respond to natural hazards. In this context, women, local communities, and indigenous people are among the most vulnerable who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Integrating human rights, gender, responsiveness, and indigenous people's knowledge into NDC's implementation will therefore contribute to stronger, more effective, and more equitable climate outcomes. Many NDCs highlight the importance of human rights, gender responsiveness, and indigenous people and traditional knowledge. At the same time, there is a lack of capacity to address these cross-cutting issues and integrate them into climate actions. This forum here today offers a great opportunity to discuss the experience of countries with regard to assessing capacity building needs and gaps related to cross-cutting issues and what kind of support they need.
Last but not least, the third topic for today's discussion will be the tracking and reporting of NDC implementation and progress. This aspect is crucial, particularly since NDCs need to be regularly updated and progressively made more ambitious to be able to achieve the goals in the Paris Agreement. We'll have the opportunity today to discuss current efforts with regard to tracking and reporting on NDC implementation, and shed some light on the good practices in this area, including work under the CBIT Global Coordination Platform. Now, let me quickly run through the structure of today's program. We start with a keynote presentation and question and answer to set the scene, and we'll then move into a panel discussion where we'll delve a bit deeper into the three subtopics of the event. Our distinguished panellists have been asked to provide short and crisp remarks to allow for interactive discussion after their initial remarks, and we look forward to your questions. With these fresh ideas from the panel discussion, we are then inviting you all to participate in one of three breakout groups. Each breakout group will focus on one of the three topics that have been mentioned. All groups will later report back on the plenary, so even if you're not able to move around and engage in all three groups, you'll be able to not miss out on those discussions and those outcomes. Please refer to the webpage for the program and information about the speakers and the coordinators of each of those groups and the guiding questions for the breakout sessions. Being environmentally conscious, we have not printed out any papers because the Durban Forum has been and will continue to be paperless for a long time. Thank you.
We would also like to inform you that there is a participant evaluation survey online, which we encourage all of you to kindly complete after the forum. It is a very simple, easy to use survey. The web link for the survey is now being projected on the screen, and it is also available on the 7th Durban Forum webpage. The online survey can be accessed until Saturday evening, and it will not take you too much time. It will be a few minutes time of your time. Thank you for that.
So without further ado, let us first invite our keynote presenter for today, who is Yamida Dede. And I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Probably not. Sorry. Yes, well, would you like to? Yeah. We'd just like to say again, thank you to the chair for spending time with us, and please, sir, enjoy your afternoon. Thank you. I thought it was French.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So yes, my name is Yamida Daniet, and I am a senior associate at the World Resource Institute. I am going to actually talk to you bearing my two hats. Actually, I am also working part-time for the support unit of the NDC partnership. And this combination in Durban, I am leading the UNFCCC work, so the research analysis, to inform the international negotiations on climate change. And with the NDC partnership, I am trying to really see how to help countries on the ground in implementing their NDCs. And I would like to thank the Durban platform team for giving me the opportunity to share my experience with you. And I am sure, I hope it's going to be inspiring, but I'm sure that I will learn a lot from you as well throughout the afternoon. So the first thing that I was asked to do is to give you, to start with an assessment of what has happened, where we are on capacity building. And this is a very difficult task to do. So I will start humbly by saying that I looked at one source, especially from the NDC partnership platform. When the NDC partnership, which is a coalition of several countries and also different institutions around the world, which was created launched in Marrakesh, at the COP in Marrakesh, has been developing a number of tools to stimulate, to foster access to knowledge, to funding. And when you go to one of those tools, you can put, okay, on NDCP, what are the areas I want to see? Well, the scope of NDCs are mitigation, adaptation, and whether you would like to see what kind of initiatives, have been supporting capacity building, and I put global initiatives. And it comes with at least 48 initiative, and that's 42. Sorry. So it's just to say that there's a lot of initiative out there to look at, but it can be quite overwhelming. And just on MRV alone, because I happen to be a negotiator on MRV before joining the BRI, and I've been following that issue for some time, you have initiatives like PASTI, CBIT, ICAT. There's at least 7 major initiatives led by some countries, global in nature, public-private partnerships sometimes. And then you do have those that are a little bit more external from UNFCCC, like the science-based targets, or even the task force for climate-related disclosure. On the finance that affect companies, private sector, or the financial institutions. And all of these are always useful, and there's a real need to coordinate and to leverage those initiatives effectively. And I know that my colleague from UNDP later is going to give you an example on this. But yes, 42, and what we see within those particular initiatives is that the needs are pretty common among countries very often, and this is based on the submissions that have been made by parties, but also the experience that we've seen within the NDC Partnership Support Unit since 2016. Countries come to us, they would ask for support to do a roadmap, an implementation plan for their NDCs, and which would be also accompanied by an investment plan. Generally, in order to track, the progress for their implementation of their NDCs, they would want to seek also support on monitoring, reporting, and verification their system. And this is where already, when they come to us, we have to make the link with existing initiatives, supporting them on in this respect. But there's also a need very often to enhance the institutional setting, legislative setting as well. And raising awareness, communication is always also in the picture. That includes also very often some forms of training in various areas and for different stakeholders. But what I put in blue in this slide is to highlight, what I think in 2016, we had mainly the first bullets, those areas highlighted in the first bullets. But what we see happening more is a lot of requests to do more or in terms of mobilization of resources, matching, aligning different proposals. So countries who have been working in making proposals to the GCF, for example, coming back to see how to better align and demonstrate that it's not overlapping, but leveraging existing other initiatives. And that in itself require the mobilization of human resources very often to just do that job in tracking and doing those proposals and making the most of them. The other increasing area is the link with the SDGs, how to mainstream climate, the NDCs, the SDGs into the sectors and integrate this into the budget planning. And this is where, we start looking at working with both ministries of environment, ministries of planning and finance. And the other thing is more interest in developing 2050 long-term strategies. And there, it's not only because it is an encouragement into the Paris Agreement to do, another report to do, but really a tool to really set up the vision of a country of what they would like to be and where they would need also to be. And the last bullet is just to highlight that there are concrete, also tangible projects. Not you do have activities in cross-cutting activities like governance, MRV, but in addition to that, you would have transformational projects at sectoral level, whether it's on energy, on agriculture, on forests. So and for that, there's a lot of requests to support countries in developing concept notes, in doing feasibility studies, in moving towards the bankability of a project, and all of this in alignment with what they could, put forward also with the GCF. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we have been seeing and the evolution also of the type of requests that we see. And the drivers for these particular needs and requests is this arc of ambitions. As you know, in 2015, the NDCs that have been submitted when aggregated are not near where we need to be. So I tried to match, what you will see here are aspects of capacity buildings and the outcome that are thought on capacity building to really support what we call this arc of ambition from now till the next round every 5 years of NDCs until 2050. And what you see is, very often you start with the tracking, enhanced tracking system. This is aspirational. And enhanced governance, and I mentioned already the institution, legislations, and the participatory process. Enhanced coordination, and I need to stop there because you've seen that there are so many initiatives. There's a lot of very often competitions and initiative on the ground, and very often the countries, when they have to look at everything that they can leverage to really support the implementation of their NDCs, are quite lost. And then when they come to assess what they need to do to go beyond, or just to make sure that they're going to get to achieve the targets that they committed to, they would try to approach, to engage with some of the donors and implementing agencies on the ground. And this is where the alignment between some of the priorities from the donor communities and their needs, those conversations, are happening. And what we see is that there's more and more efforts. It's a huge task. We're not necessarily where we need to be yet, but there's more and more interest from the donor community to try to coordinate better on the grounds with implementing agencies so that they also have a more results-oriented framework of cooperation and they prevent overlap. So we see that emerging a little bit more, but this is absolutely crucial to make sure that we deliver effectively and help also countries to go beyond. And then this notion of enhanced access of support. This is also critical. From providing the human resources that countries often need to get to the path of identifying what they need, the plan, the investment plans, and do the job of alignment and engagement with key partners. This is important for them to get the attractability they need to the investors as well. So that's an important expectation here. And what you see below that arc of ambitions are elements, I would say building blocks that really support this. The enhanced access to information, training, education, The NDC partnership work a lot to try to create some sort of one-stop shop with the knowledge, tool, and products that countries could produce. But one area on communication, I think, and my colleagues are going to look at this and mention this, is communication. NDCs are implemented from the international requirements and commitments to the national implementation, subnational local implementation as well. And this is where language is important. And very often there's not a lot of funding dedicated to this. Climate, I mentioned the need for the mainstreaming, for the synergies between the two agendas. It includes also the synergies with the biodiversity, desertification conventions as well, but gender and indigenous people. This is a request that also we see more and more emerging. One of the tool to help countries get into that enhanced capacity to secure funding is also to have more and more accredited entities. And we see that those entities find it very important, more important to have in their portfolio, to include the gender elements of their portfolio. And what we also see from the donor side is a push and an emergence of not only a gender strategy, but even feminist strategies that goes even beyond, and that requires an overview of the whole value chain that could affect, the involvement of women into the implementation of their NDCs. And on the indigenous side, I think this is what I have seen are some discussions about the way to integrate indigenous more into the existing institutions, especially universities, and what research needs to be, how the research needs to embrace a little bit more that side. In addition to the participation, of course, of those key constituencies. Yes, this is just an illustration. I was, asked also to give, some mapping. If you, in 18 months, in less than 18 months, the NDC partnership created, attracting now 71 countries, and I think that by the end of this month we will be close to 75. So the request is huge, and the collaboration and opportunities, offered are equally big. So it's just to show the expansion and to demonstrate that a lot of countries are really serious about it. And from a regional point of view, you see that in Latin America, you have at least 18 countries. In Latin America and the Caribbean, 18 countries. In Africa, 22. The rest in Asia Pacific, and with the donor community. And this is delivered, with the support of a wide range of institutions. Another lesson from the NDC partnership in terms of country engagement is that cycle of implementation. Very concretely, when a country comes with a request to us, one of the things that we do is, okay, what is happening? Let's try to get the cartography, the mapping of what's going on, right? Who are the existing partners involved in climate action? So that rapid situational assessment is very important. We do it with the country, and then once we've got that document, we circulate it to donors so that they can react already. Oh, this is the situation, these are the needs, the priority. How does it align already with the areas that we would like to support? And then I think a very critical stage after this assessment is, to do a kind of partnership plan. And this is a little bit what, the registries that we currently have, the registry of NAMAS, the original idea to try to create a matching tool becomes quite important. We want it to be result-based, but what we do, this tool is really aligning the supply and the demand. And it goes through sometimes prioritization processes. A country can come with 20 projects that are part of their investment plan. They have to prioritize maybe 3 to 5 originally that would rally a number of co-financing. And this is what we're trying to do, and to be clear with the indicators, and we do have workshops to agree together about the indicators of success and progress, to really be able to see what everybody is doing, where we are acting, how the pace of evolution and progress, and that mapping, that document is really critical, and from them you can have that implementation, coordination of implementation, review cycle, but reaching that stage is a critical part, and it takes time. And this is actually, I am going to this is an example from a country who identified a number of enabling environment activities with some development projects, and yes, having their implementation plan. Now, actually, this is my last slide. So I come to an end. I would just highlight a number of factors and best success factors and best practice from this experience. The nomination, when a country comes to the NDC partnership, the first thing that is being requested, and we will actually respond really when they come back with 2 focal points, one from the Ministry of Environment, one from the Ministry of Finance or Planning. This is really, that makes a lot of difference. We had in the first year a number of countries who came only with the Ministry of Environment, and we see that they would struggle to do the mainstreaming that is very often needed, including also when it comes to the budget. So it makes a difference to have those 2 involved at the beginning. Effective facilitation on the ground to make sure that the involvement of any donor implementing agency is effective and country-driven. So there's discussion on how best to do that, if it needs to be embodied into the government itself. I mentioned how important the mobilization of human resources is. Very often countries are just stuck despite the will, the political will to start, because there's simply nobody to take this work. The institutional arrangements for tracking progress and multi-stakeholder engagement is something that often needs to be strengthened. The value of regional peer-to-peer learning, dialogue opportunities, we've seen that several times. We organized a few of them, and there's a lot of added value, especially when you consider the language and you do that, taking into account the language. The matching, I mentioned, I spent some time to say how important this is. And I would say building trust and legitimacy to nurture the neutrality. I think from the NDC partnership point of view, our strength has been that we had a support unit that didn't have a tag necessarily of an organization and could go and help countries and serve sometimes as a broker between countries and agencies, and also trying to create the link and put in contact different stakeholders to move forward. And I think whilst we see an impetus in the consideration of indigenous knowledge and integration of gender, there's still a lot of there's a big need to make sure that it becomes almost natural and becomes systematic, and understand what is transformational. It's not just ticking the box in having a representation of 50% in a workshop of women. There's a willingness to go beyond, but understanding exactly the drivers and the transformational outcome remains important. What I didn't mention that we will hear this afternoon is human rights. We didn't have a lot of requests that embed, the notion of human rights, if I am completely honest. I think it is underlying, but it's not something that we necessarily grasp, and we can work and learn from each other about that. Thank you. I'm sorry I took a little bit longer, but thanks.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Yamide. In due of time, I would open the floor for any questions. So for Yamide, if anyone wants to take the floor, please do. In the back.
Good day. My name is Ruth Spencer, and I'm from the Caribbean island of Antigua and Barbuda. We have some major challenges in the process. For example, waste management is a big issue in my country, and all the local stakeholders, NGOs, local communities, groups, private sector that are engaged in some form of waste recycling, waste diversion, repurposing, we have come together and we have formed the group. While I'm here, I got an email from our chair saying that a private big investor with a lot of money has approached the government of Antigua with a project. Whereas we are trying to meet the sustainable goals and support local pilot projects to upscale them, taking into account the social factors for income and generation. Here it is, a company that has the financing, seeing the opportunity, but the factors that you listed for success, local buying and ownership, trust, we have been completely bypassed in the process. And I'm here, so I told the chair to try and make an opportunity, try to set up a meeting with our Prime Minister, because the same possibility that this private investor sees, we see it, but we are going the circular economy where we are trying, to build up local businesses, local expertise, the peer learning. We meet monthly, and the process has really been educational. So, I just feel, I'm here and I feel I cannot do anything. We are also putting together a strategic plan where we have already done the social component with the attitudes, behavioral change. We have been looking at technologies to suit our small size and scale. And then this big investor, I don't even know if he has the data for the waste streams and the waste categorization scheme and things like that. So these are some of the real problems that you face on the ground. You're trying to meet your sustainable goals, you're trying for the inclusion, you're trying to use local knowledge, but then sometimes somewhere you get left out of the process. Even though we have 25 local groups involved in this group, we are really trying to make an impact. So I'm just sharing this experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would invite others to present their questions. So Yamide could answer. Yes, please, Tara.
Thank you, Yamid, for your presentation. Just picking up on the last points you were making, and you said that there was an openness and perhaps requests around how to bring gender into NDCs, gender equality into NDCs. Could you give us an example of that? Is that help to integrate, or is it that people are already doing it but they want to do it in a different way, or countries don't know where to start? Just a little bit more information would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.
Yes.
Other questions? May we just take more questions? Well, maybe I will add another question, Yamide. I would like for you to explain a little bit more on how you integrate indigenous and gender into the projection of the programs that you are developing in the countries, and of course, second, supporting my colleague, how come it hasn't been brought up the issue of human rights? Within climate change, human rights is an important issue due to the fact that the vulnerable societies of our countries are mostly women and children and indigenous people in some of our countries, but the climate factor is affecting them tremendously, and that's one big question there. Also, the strengthening of our institutional arrangements are very important, and you mentioned that in the beginning you were working directly only with environmental ministries, and now you have added planning and finance. Has there come across any other ministries that could also be a part of this, or are we just talking about those three, or are you flexible opening up to other ministries that may be also in the game? Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent questions. I will take the opportunity to just say to my colleague from Antigua that unfortunately, these situations happen. I think what we have been encouraging is those consultation. So it's not consultation for the sake of consultation, but it seems that those countries who have been investing a lot as a process, to create that ownership and to consult different stakeholders many times over the year, to have that process is important. And that links also to the institutional arrangement. And the example, that I can give is that in one country, in Mali, since we started, actually the minister triggered the organization, the establishment of a steering committee to monitor the implementation of their NDC. And since 2011, there was a National Council on Climate Change, but that was never made really operational. And thanks now that things got started, they really got it function. And there was a reflection about an evolving reflection about who needed to be in this National Council and in this steering committee to make sure that we prevent there's a minimum of safeguards and opportunities are not missed from the local to the national. So I think the institutional arrangement that Rita has mentioned are important for that. And staying on the institutional arrangement, the reason why the Ministry of Environment is leading, the implementation of the NDCs. That has been, they're leading the environmental and climate agenda most of the time. But we know and we hear all the time, without means of implementation, we're stuck. At the core of the NDC, you've got, what is conditional, what is unconditional. And therefore, there's also commitment of the countries also, to support domestically without before getting international support, to drive the agenda. So the Ministry of Finance and Planning need to be involved. It doesn't mean that, and because also the Ministry of Planning and Finance, they often, at the core of the budget and planification of the growth strategy, and therefore very often they do have a kind of piloting, framing team that is looking at the different sectors. And the other one decided, okay, there's going to be this budget allocated to each sector. So it's not bypassing the sectoral ministries, but it's a way to make sure that it helps getting the other ministries involved. Of course, you know, when you're NDC, you have a target on energy, on forestry. You need to get your Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry involved, your Ministry of Energy involved. But very often they do have different priorities. They do have different constraints. And one way to try to get everybody also on board is to use and to make sure that the Ministry of Planning and Finance use its power by understanding the opportunity, the growth opportunity to, you know, in incorporating climate change. So this is why we've done that. And on gender and indigenous people. So an example is from a project point of view, you know, in one of the country, agriculture is a huge part of the GDP. And the roles that women play in agriculture is really important, and you would need to go at subnational level. And there's an association of women who tried to build some cooperative, and the idea was to try to, you know, scale up that initiative throughout the country. And so there was this emergence of these projects, but it lacked financing. So the idea is, okay, how does this project led by women has all the kind of gender or feminist criteria to make sure that they attract those the funding from those countries, you know, who really want to see such an outcome. And with indigenous people, it's sometimes a little bit, it's not as tangible. We get them participating in meetings, but then it's more difficult. They're part of committees, but it's difficult to see necessarily to have project that has really an impact. It's more the co-benefits, if you like, of a project that will have an impact on them, that you know where they come into account. What we see, however, is a willingness to get the indigenous knowledge embedded into some of the curriculum, and to try to bring them also into the research side in the academia a lot more, so that it embrace there's to embrace that resource as it has not been done before into the fight of climate change. So that is emerging. It's not again. This is just emerging, and I think we need to push. And I didn't want to go too much beyond, because my expert colleagues are going to discuss those issues. But this is what emerged, and I think human rights again become a co-benefit. So there's never a request about addressing a particular human rights problem, but what we see is a country would come with a project that, you know, on energy, in doing those solar in a particular place where there's actually conflict, and the core benefit would be security, the climate security. Another benefit would be supporting the rights of the indigenous people. So it comes as a co-benefits. So what we see emerging is bringing that co-benefits, like in terms of sustainable developments and human rights, even if it's not direct. So.
Thank you, Yamide. There's another question in the back.
Thank you. I'm Guy Kamal from the International Labour Organization. Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I wanted to see from your perspective and experience in the NDC partnership, to what extent you see countries involving the social partners in the process formulation, but also more importantly in the implementation. And what I mean by social partners are employee organizations, workers organizations. And if you really think of the type of transformational change that countries are seeking to achieve through the NDCs, it will require having enterprises that are able to produce differently, different production methods. It will require a workforce with new skills, new ways of producing. And from the ILO's point of view, as a tripartite organization, we have realized that the level of engagement of social partners, fully in the NDC formulation and implementation process has been the exception rather than the rule. And these are actors in the real economy. When you want to transform your energy system, you need technicians, you need energy auditors. So how, in your experience, have these actors be involved, and what prospect do we have to step up that engagement? Thank you.
This is a good question. I agree with you about the importance of engagement. Yeah.
We have another question, okay, and one more from me.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. We'll ask, and then you can respond all of them. We have another question here. An answer. Okay, so before you answer, I just wanted to ask, when you design the projects at the national level, how do you design the capacity building factor in the projects? Do you do it as beforehand, or do you do it throughout the development of the project? And what is the tool that you're utilizing in order to make sure that capacity building is a strong factor and gives you the results for the future of the sustainability of the results of the project in the end? And I think Russell has another one. Yeah. And with that, we would close.
Thanks, Mina. Just one question. So Australia actually is pleased to be the co-sponsor of the NDC partnership and on the steering committee. We also fund the NDC hub, which has just been created in Fiji. And I wanted to ask your view on, again, looking at capacity building, but what's what do you see as the benefit of capacity building from these sort of regional partnerships that are now starting to be talked about under the NDC partnership? So instead of going from 71 individual countries to these sort of regional groupings, how does that help capacity building in the region?
Thank you, Russell. Should we give the word to Lorena to respond, and then you can wrap up? Thank you. Thank you, Yamid.
Thank you. I'm going to talk on like IUCN. For the past 8 years, thanks to the support of governments like Finland and US, we have developing climate change interaction plans supporting the implementation of the NDCs in no less than 25 countries worldwide. And what it has been very interesting is that it brings together the Ministry of Women Affairs, the Ministry of Environment, institutions in charge of climate change, transport, energy, all together to discuss how to mainstream gender in already either their national climate change strategies or in the process of developing their NDCs. And it had meant capacity building on all the different sectors. For example, for women organizations and the Ministry of Women Affairs or Indigenous peoples organization or representatives to understand the linkages of climate change and gender, for example. What are the entry points? On the other side, it has also meant building the capacity of those people working on climate change of what are the linkages. But it has been a very interesting process that has allowed the countries to have better capacity to approach and a more sustained initiative through, hopefully, the following years.
Thank you, Lorena. Yamide?
Yes, so I think the social question, yes, has been answered because I totally agree with you about, we've seen in the NDC partnership consultation, those that have been very transformational are those bringing those different ministries together, and also the association, the trade associations, the association of, employers. We've seen that. The first, it's gradual. The first consultation is a kind of digestions of what where are the opportunities. But then by the second consultation, especially this phase of alignment of the supply and the demand, this is where, we're starting to see, workers, private sector saying, the local private sector, not necessarily international investors saying, hey, we're ready, actually, we've got ideas here. And sometimes it surprised the government would have just assumed that they would only have to rely on international partners. So that's important. And then to answer the question from Rita, the kind of tools that we're using for capacity building. In the NDC partnership, you do have, so first of all, for capacity building, there's the access of information. And in the NDC partnership, there's a lot of organizations and, to access those kind of visual tools, mapping, those navigators that have been created. There's the Climate Resource Watch, with the BRI that has been created, but there's many more. And I think creating that one-stop shop is one thing. But I would say that capacity building is a process. So, the country and the document, this partnership plan is actually very dynamic. It doesn't stop at one point. So there's going to be always a kind of review at some stage. This is the preliminary. We're in this planning phase, so we need to understand, we need to have some sort of capacity building. But as we're moving into bankability and projects to be delivered on the ground, we need other sort of capacity building. And this is where you bring different type of actors. And it requires, the NDC partnership and the donor community to be aware and to react, knowing the different type of requests. And the regional hubs on NDCs that have been created, at the beginning we thought, oh, there's huge overlap. How to reduce that? Actually, very often they would rely more on institutions that are very much embedded into those regions. And for the NDC partnership, it's not possible to have as a member everybody. So actually, the information that those regional hubs are going to create, we can just leverage instead of having to redo it. So I think there's ways, again, it's a reflection. It's not, everything is emerging at a pace, but I think there are definitely ways to avoid, so for example, what is the state of NDC implementation in Africa? NDCP doesn't have to do, the support unit doesn't have to do it. Actually, this regional hub is going to generate that assessment, come back with already solutions and some case studies, and we would only need to trace this or to put it into context or to use that to support our partners in a more integrated manner.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your responses and your insights of all the work that that the NDC partnership has carried out throughout the world. And so now I give the word to my colleague, Russell.
Thank you. Thank you, Amita. Thanks very much. Just a round of applause for you, Amita, I think. We were just saying the NDC partnership was started only 18 months ago and has had a huge amount of work and made a lot of progress in that small time, and is really critical to the support of the Paris Agreement and to all countries to implement their NDC. So we thank Humida and we thank the NDC partnership more broadly for the work that they're doing. So thanks very much. We'd like to move on to the next part of the program now, which is the panel discussion. It's my pleasure to invite Ari Hutula, which I probably pronounced wrong as well, to the podium. And I'd like to ask the 4 panelists to also start coming up so that we can keep that moving. So we've got Marwan, Tara, Hindu, and Miriam, if you'd also like to make your way up, ready for Ari to introduce you. Thanks.
Okay, good afternoon. While our panelists are on their way here, let me already start talking because we're a bit behind schedule and we have a lot of ground to cover. Yamid has really covered an interesting range of gaps and issues, and I think we will now try to grapple a few of them a little bit more in detail. We've been told already earlier at this meeting that now the Durban Forum and the PCCB are more aligned, and I think that's one of the key elements also of discussion now, that whatever our panelists tell us and want to share with us, we should also try to think how could the PCCB make best use of those messages and that information. In reading some older reports of the Durban Forum, I came across with a few things that Yamid didn't touch upon, and that's why I thought I would add them to the menu of challenges and issues that we already know, and now we should see how to deal with them. The Durban Forum has concluded that sustainable capacity building for mitigation, adaptation, and technology relies on long-term, continuous and demand-driven support. The dependence on external consultants and the corresponding memory loss at the end of projects or programs has been identified as a major challenge in the way of building sustainable capacity. I think this is another important building block for our discussion this afternoon with four panelists. We will start with a country experience from Indonesia. Mr. Mahawan Karun Lasa, member of the PCCB, the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. You may also wish to add your credentials in Indonesia if you wish. But we would very much like you to discuss with us really your country experience. How can participatory approaches and long-term engagement be introduced to ensure ownership of processes and outcomes in the implementation of NDCs? How can your project developers and project developers of the institutions that support you from abroad ensure that the institutional memory accumulated during the implementation is retained in Indonesia? And how can capacity building projects encourage domestic innovation? So I'll give you your 5 minutes, Mr. Mahawan.
Thank you, Ari, and it's a great pleasure for me to share in the Indonesian experience in this event. This experience and lesson learned for the implementation of Indonesian NDCs is there is a very important period. This pre-2020 implementation of Indonesian commitment is an important period to explore the experiences and lesson learned. And some key lesson learned and experiences. The first is about the institutional arrangement. And we have the experience that the authority of the institution is very important. And also the permanent institution is key for the implementation of the climate change agenda. We have experienced in 2008, we have ad hoc council, but in 2015, the presidents integrated that council into the Minister of Environment and Forestry, and this institution getting stronger. And the second is about mainstreaming. That is very challenging, and we have a very progressive agenda on these issues. And Indonesia has been conducting mainstreaming to the spatial plan, to the national development plan, through the mainstreaming directly into that the strategic or the development plan, but also through the strategic environmental assessment. That is a very powerful instrument in Indonesia because it is mandatory for for all of the policy plan and program in Indonesia. But the challenges for this mainstreaming is the awareness of sectoral and subnational leaders, including the political leaders including the legislators. Without approval from legislator, the mainstreaming only on the document, not on the ground. And the third is issues that also critical is monitoring of emission and resiliency gaps. Now in Indonesia already have one data policy. We have only one data of emission, but still challenge on adaptation issue, especially to monitor the resiliency level. That is this is more complex rather than compared to the emission issues. And regarding the participatory approach and long-term engagement, it is very important to emphasize to address this issue on the strategic or long-term policies, plans, programs, and its periodic monitoring that use this document or use this agenda. The long-term engagement can be implemented because the parties involved for the long-term planning, for an example, at subnational development planning or also regional spatial plan. And also the issues about the accumulating the institutional memory. In addition that mainstreaming climate change agenda into the long-term and mid-term regional development plans or strategic plan of the sectoral area have additional benefit that stakeholder could earn benefit from this area, especially for institutional engagement rather than the individual engagement. This is, we have an experience with individual engagement that the dynamics of the organization, some person in charge, some personnel move from one organization to others, so it is very challenging to involve the person for individual engagement. So it is important to focus on institutional engagement to accumulating the institutional memory. And the last issue is encouraging domestic innovation. I think that capacity project and activities that fits in the context or align with national, sectoral or subnational agenda provide more chance for domestic or local innovation. But in the other hand, it's also challenged that the agenda of sectoral and subnational is in line with the climate change issues or sustainable development. So political agenda in subnational and sectoral is also the challenge, and it is about the awareness of at the political system. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you mentioned the different levels of institutional capacity, including the local, the cities and the provinces, because the subnational, because that is very often forgotten in this conversation. Going from a country implementation to a very important issue of cross-cutting issues that were already touched upon by Yamid, I'll turn to Tara Shine, who is a special advisor to the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, to discuss what the experience, how you actually find that capacity building providers effectively support developing countries in building their capacities to integrate these cross-cutting issues into NDC implementation, and how can alignment of capacity building support with existing processes such as the Gender Action Plan actually be promoted. Tara.
Thank you, Ari. Good afternoon, everyone. So the PCCB has 3 cross-cutting issues that it has identified: Indigenous people's rights, human rights, and gender equality. So I'm going to leave Indigenous people's rights to the expert right beside me and leave that to Hindu. And I'm going to focus in on gender equality and human rights and what we've learned in the Mary Robinson Foundation, but with a lot of partners that are here in the room, around the integration of gender equality and human rights into climate action, which need to obviously try and capture that learning and make sure that it informs NDCs, their implementation, and obviously their further revision and iteration. So maybe to start with gender, gender equality is more mature in this process than human rights. You know, we have to go back to a Marrakesh COP back in 2001 for our first decision on gender. 10 years later in Doha, we had a decision that built on that, but was very much focused around gender balance and women's representation in the UNFCCC. And then it wasn't until really the Lima COP that we really got this broader focus on gender equality and on the gender responsive climate action, and a much more complete understanding of gender equality as applied to climate action. And what we can see is that there is a growth in understanding of the gender dimensions of climate change. If we look to the NDCs as one measure of that, 40% of NDCs, 65 countries made a reference to gender equality, are women in their NDC. That's good. I imagine that's better than it would have been 10 years beforehand, but it also shows that there's a lot of room for improvement. The other striking thing about the statistic around the 65 countries is that they are all developing countries. So it is developing countries that are more aware, it would seem, of the links between climate change and gender equality, paradoxically, than developed countries. And this is something that we discussed in the gender workshop yesterday, around how developed countries in their aid programs have quite stringent requirements around gender equality and gender mainstreaming, but this isn't always reflected in national policies. Most recently, at the last COP, COP23, one of the most significant outcomes was the adoption of a gender action plan. And there is a strong focus on capacity building within that gender action plan. And I think that's a real area for the PCCB to look to see how the Paris Committee on Capacity Building can work with and support these initiatives in the Gender Action Plan. So there's workshops and technical assistance planned to enhance the capacity of parties to develop gender-sensitive policies and plans. There's provisions for capacity building and training on leadership, negotiation and facilitation for women delegates. There's an emphasis on education and training programs to target women and youth in countries from the national level right down to the local level, and with the startings of specific attention to the needs of grassroots women, women in frontline communities, and Indigenous women's ability to access those programs too. There's capacity building for the chairs and members of the UNFCCC constituted bodies so that they can better integrate gender equality into their work. And as well then capacity building back at the national level for the national gender mechanisms, members of parliament and NGOs, so that they better understand the links between gender and climate change. So there's quite a lot happening there already on gender that I think there's a real opportunity to connect the dots between some of that capacity building work under the Gender Action Plan and the planned work of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. If I move on then to look at human rights a little, the understanding of human rights, of people-centered approaches to climate action, of the need for rights-based approaches to climate action, whether that's in the area of mitigation or adaptation or climate finance, is less mature within the UNFCCC. What we can see is when we look back at national communications, at NAPAs and at submissions the countries make to the Human Rights Council under the Universal Periodic Review, we can see that, it is not the majority of countries yet that are actually making the links between human rights and climate change. Developing countries tend to be more in advance in terms of making the links between climate impacts and human rights. And we know that about 40% of national communications and 4% of NAPAs that we looked at between 2010 and 2015 looked at the link between human rights and climate change. The numbers then fall off again when we look at countries that are really connecting the dots nationally between their human rights policies and their climate change policies. So in the period 2010 to 2015, only 14 countries consistently made the links between human rights and climate change, both in their reports to the UNFCCC and in their reports to the Human Rights Council. But in good news, and maybe showing that we are getting there a little bit in terms of raising awareness, by 2017, this had risen to 26 countries that had successfully made the connections between human rights and climate change, both in their reporting to the UNFCCC and to the Human Rights Council. But what we do know as a foundation from the events that we've been convening for over the last 8 years in human rights and climate change, and more recently the events that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has been convening on human rights and climate change, is that negotiators are very clear that, climate negotiators are very clear that they have a capacity gap in the area of human rights. Many climate change policymakers and negotiators come from the same kind of background as me in environmental science or climate science, where you don't get taught an awful lot about human rights. And so in responding to that, for example, the foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation, put together in 2015 a document called Rights for Action that just tried in the simplest terms to explain what are the links between human rights and climate change, how does human rights benefit climate action, how does it help to support climate action that is good for the planet and good for people. So those types of resources and tools, there's still a demand for. You know, and that makes me think about the role of capacity building providers and those supporting countries now to implement their NDCs. And I think that to date there has tended to be a focus more on the technical and scientific capacity elements of climate action, climate policy making, and that the social dimensions of climate change have not tended to be given the same level of attention within capacity building activities to date. And what I think is that means that there is an onus really on capacity building providers to balance the attention they give to the technical and scientific aspects of climate change with the social aspects, human rights, gender equality, inclusiveness, participation, access to information. All of these things need to become much more part of all aspects of capacity building on climate change, whether that's on mitigation or adaptation or loss and damage, for example. I think that providers of climate change capacity building don't necessarily need to become experts in this themselves. They just need to link with people that are experts. So, for example, if UNEP or UNITAR are providing capacity building on climate change, they can link with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to access the latest knowledge and information on human rights and as that pertains to climate change. I think it would be really interesting to see co-produced knowledge and training products for climate change with experts in human rights, whether that is civil society, think tanks, or again, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Likewise, I think it would be interesting to provide specific training on people-centered and rights-based action as part of NDC capacity building, so that NDCs are rolled out in line with the commitments made in the preamble of the Paris Agreement to respect human rights in all climate actions, to respect gender equality in all climate actions. And another suggestion might be also to think about the fact that there traditionally hasn't been a lot of expertise within the UNFCCC Secretariat in human rights. There are experts in all kinds of aspects of climate change, but there isn't expertise to help build the capacity of everyone in the Secretariat and then to support parties in understanding how and the why of how to do human rights-based climate action. So I think having some kind of human rights focal point within the UNFCCC could really help to build capacity. In that way, for example, in supporting our colleagues in the Secretariat on capacity building, that person will be able to help them figure out how best to bring the human rights aspects on. Ari, I'm nearly finished. What else did I want to say? So then just in terms of real practical things that I think we could think about, I think it would be really important for this Durban Forum to acknowledge that human rights are a capacity gap for all parties, developed and developing. I think then it would be really useful to think about how the PCCB can help to fill that gap. And one thing that I think would be really useful there is to think about perhaps co-organizing a workshop with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to look at human rights as a capacity gap and the steps that could be taken to address it in the context of NDCs, but really broadly across all aspects of climate action. And then, building on that, it might be interesting to think about how you could document and share good practices from some countries, to think about how to develop tools and guidance for parties. I think that's something that many parties have expressed to us that they would need. Is to help them to figure out step by step how they would do that, and then to think about how to build within countries and within the Secretariat capacity around understanding rights and how rights can be really beneficial in helping to inform people-centered climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Thanks also for very concrete suggestions, and I hope they will all be duly recorded in the report of this event. Turning now to Hindu Umaru Ibrahim from the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. Fairly similar kinds of questions, really. How can alignment of capacity building support with existing processes actually can bring the indigenous peoples platform? And if you have any good examples and inspiring examples of where indigenous communities have been successfully engaged in the development of an NDC, it would be interesting to hear. And if not, why not?
Actually, this is very challenging questions, but just as I'm coming from the LDCs countries, maybe let me give you the overview of how people design already the NDCs. So the designation of NDCs took just like 2 months or 40 days, and that's have been designed by expert coming from outside, that's calling consultancy, who help maybe another local expert that designed the NDCs, sitting in the office and then writing, okay, what will be the priority of the country, how we can do that. And then the consequences of this kind of process, rushing that, because every country have to present something to the tables, put that most of them present a project that harm the human rights, and specifically the indigenous people rights. And one of the example is the mega dam project in Nepal, where it's going to the indigenous land and violating the rights of indigenous peoples. Rather than doing mitigation, doing much violation of the environmental right and right of the peoples. But it's not only in Nepal, but it's many countries around the world where they develop the NDCs and put it in the table without the consultations and without the proper mechanism. So the lesson we have to learn from it is how we can change these already designed NDCs by maybe some expert, but they are not expert of the environment that is impacted by the climate change. And this place is the space of the indigenous peoples who are expert from the land. So like the example that I can give you is from the chat NDCs. So we had like 2 months around just to design it. But from our side, as indigenous peoples, we went to the community, we discussed with them from the language that they understand. I mean, the real peoples who are living in the real land that we are talking about, they do not know what is NDCs mean, but they know exactly what is the land mean. They know what is the water, they know what is the forest, what the environment. So we went there, we consulted with them about what's going to be designed into the NDCs program. And then they say, oh, first thing we want to have human rights. Second, gender. Third, environmental protection for our forests. And then we come back there, we just like host a small lunch and we invite the Minister of Environment. And we invite also those experts who are writing the NDCs who come, and then we say, well, we are here to represent the voice of the communities. So in this chat NDCs, if you check it, they do not have human rights, gender, and forest environmental protections. That cannot work for the peoples. And then that make now in the chat NDCs have these 3 components societal issues in our design little NDCs. So, but when we see the broader global NDCs, we have 24 countries who have human rights and 19 countries who have indigenous peoples. And all the mentioned that are not like substantial through the proper way of consultation of the indigenous communities. So how we can reinforce the capacity gap this within all the 196 countries who accepted kindly all the Paris Agreement, because this is the provision under the Paris Agreement that we're talking about it. So I think there is a need of the capacity within the community firstly to understand what we are talking about, because we don't need only to talk among the experts, among the convinced people who know what is NDCs, and the next, okay, we are going to report back, but we need to make understand the people that we are designing the NDC for them. What are we putting there? So this need to be fed at capacity to those people to understand in order to input in the NDCs. And secondly, we need also the capacity building to the government peoples to say that those issues are what? Yeah. Okay, as cross-cutting. Like, okay, you're cutting me? No. So, so there are cross-cutting issues. So indigenous peoples are victims, sure. But we are also a solution because we are offering our traditional knowledge to help implement mitigation and adaptation. And those solutions, we do not ask like technology that we need something to improve. Those knowledge improve our life and lifestyle for the thousands of years. So we want to offer this. So it needs to be integrated exactly into capacity building of countries where as indigenous experts we can tell them what is the knowledge. Because the issue on the climate change negotiations, they say like, oh yes, human rights based approach, yes, it's wonderful. But when you ask them, okay, what is the human rights based approach? I think many of them concretely do not see that. So how we can put concretely what is the human rights based approach? What is the indigenous people's rights? It means a collective rights of peoples. It means protecting collectively the forest. It means better management of natural resources. So we need to put that as tools that peoples can understand better and then they can integrate it very easily. And then in this way, we need also the capacity building among all the other thematic area to say the platform of knowledge exchange of indigenous peoples. It's not only applicable under the SAPSTA, and then we are going to discuss that in full stop. No, those knowledges are really useful for agriculture. They are useful for technology because we are linking traditional knowledge and science knowledge. They are useful for, I don't know, NAPS, because we are discussing about NAPS issues. NAMAS, all those thematic areas need to get integrated, the indigenous people's knowledge, and then they need to respect the rights of peoples also. And as Tara said, there is need of capacity inside the Secretariat. So we cannot leave them with just a thematic and then we do not know who is going to take into consideration these indigenous people's issues or human rights issues and putting cross-cutting around all the thematic. So there is need of a specific dedicated focal point on indigenous people's issue who can help to make it as cross-cutting issue through all the climate change. And this capacity, it's needed for the Secretariat, but also it's needed for the state parties who are negotiating to better understand what will be the link, who is the liaison there. If they have questions, are they going to ask International Indigenous People Forum on climate change? Maybe they say, no, we are a state, we are not going to ask them. Because at the end of the day, we are human. So as human, we have our own character that we cannot go ask this or ask that because we are country. So how we can go beyond this, how we call caprice, to make it match for the people's needs. So that is need in terms of the capacity building. And one thing that we talk as indigenous people, we said language barrier cannot help us to move for the human right. Human rights is one thing, but right of understanding, of participations, it's another thing. So we need to translate the human right-based approach that in the language that people understand. I mean, there are many countries who attend, who might understand, but might not understand everything because it's not them language, English. Only if people are in the plenary. It's good to talk among the group, like we have G77, we have umbrella group, whatever, but individual concern, this is the most important because those individuals are the ones who will implement the real project back home. So if they didn't understand what is going on, how are they going to implement it? So in this social package, gender, human rights, indigenous peoples rights need to be translated into the language that people can understand in order to better implement it during implementation time at back home. And I will finish by saying that it's very nice to talk at the international level, change policy, link it with all, and then there is this positive feeling. But we need to decentralize the action. We are talking about NDCs. NDCs, it's local level. So how we can transfer and make this capacity building down to the local level where they can understand. And then the local level can fit up to the international level. Then I think if we put it in the same way, that can help us to reach the objective of the capacity building that we need, and then indigenous peoples can take the voice. And just to be sure, we are here to help. We are not here to bother. So we have the knowledge for sure. So we need just the way of full and effective participation, understanding, and then we can be all build our capacity each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very useful contribution, also reminding us of the importance that NDCs are meant for target groups, and capacity is not only needed for the implementers, but also those who are actually going to be at the other end of the process, and also the importance of the language issue, which is so often forgotten. But this is a big challenge now for Miriam, also the tracking issue. When you go, the further you go to the local level, the more complicated it all becomes. Miriam Hinostroza is from the UNEP DTU partnership and will focus on how technical and institutional capacities for tracking of and reporting of NDC's implementation and progress can be effectively enhanced in a way that benefits the country's planning process. And how, and there is a question here, how can capacities of subnational and local governments be enhanced to coordinate cohesive tracking and development plans, links to SDGs and NDCs? So, floor is yours, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Ari. Good afternoon, everyone. After the previous presentations, I think mine is again more technical, but still considering also human rights and local communities' participation. So it was a very interesting background, and also something to add on our reflections as capacity building providers. So I should start by saying that the TU partnership supporting the UN environment on its efforts to help countries on NDC implementation is focusing on the implementation of the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. So we are supporting some numbers of countries through an initiative that is not mandated, but is as any other capacity building initiative on support to countries that you might have heard about ICAT, Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. And the other support we are providing is for the implementation of CBIT, which does have a mandate. And on that, we are supporting the implementation of something that is called CBIT Global Coordination Platform. So one of the programming priorities of the CBIT is to support activities aligned with this aim at a national and international and global levels. On the global level, on numeral 20 of the programming priorities document states the establishment of a global cross-cutting CBIT coordination platform to support the CBIT management with the engagement of the GF Secretariat. So UN Environment and UNDP are the GEF agencies supporting the implementation of this CBIT Global Coordination Platform. It is a web-based platform. You can already navigate through this. It's cbitplatform.org. And this is designed in a way that it will enable coordination, maximize learning opportunities, and enable knowledge and information sharing to facilitate transparency enhancements. So the platform engages countries, the GEF partner agencies, and other relevant entities and institutions with related programming activities to enhance partnerships of national, multilateral, and bilateral support capacity building initiatives internationally, but also locally with all the stakeholders, including local communities' participation. Additional elements of this global coordination platform include a self-assessment tool for transparency, capacity, needs, and achievements in participating countries. This means that participating countries of CBIT will have the opportunity to continuously assess their needs and gaps for capacity development in the area of transparency. Last week, it has been launched in the second technical workshop in Berlin. So global technical workshops, as I said, also are part of this initiative to exchange experiences on submission and implementation of country CBIT programs. So we are also part of this coordination platform. So far, as I said, 2 technical workshops have been organized. The first was in April last year in Copenhagen, and the second was actually organized last week in Berlin, where this platform was also launched. So to try to answer the questions, big questions actually, on how to track the implementation of NDCs. I have made these reflections based on these 2 supports. We are committed to establish country programs on the basis of consultations with countries and responding to their capacities. So just to remember, the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement establishes that all parties shall report GHG inventories and progress made in implementing and achieving NDCs. So technical and institutional capacities for tracking of and reporting on NDCs are just one of the large set of required capacities to fully implement NDCs. However, it would be unfair not to recognize that countries have made great progress on enhancing institutional capacities for reporting under the Convention. At the end, it is around 23 years that countries are working on this, responding to their commitments. However, this is just one leg of the institutional structures needed to implement NDCs. There are many other capacity lacking, as it was already said previously. In many cases, individual technical capacities within relevant institutions are still an issue, especially for the transparency. On the organizational structures, fragmentation and lack of articulation is still a characteristic in many developing countries. There are no easy solutions for this, but countries are on this endeavor, and what we are observing suggests that the Paris Agreement and the SDGs are important frameworks for countries to map capacity needs and gaps. This is facilitating identifying areas to improve current conditions, enhance existing arrangements, and consolidate and institutionalize best practices. So 2 big and crucial issues that countries are already considering will facilitate this: long-term low-emission development strategies and comprehensive and integrated governance. Long-term low-emission development strategies are crucial. It is the foundation for comprehensive, inclusive, and sustainable articulated institutions. It is the basis for reviewing and adjusting legal and regulatory frameworks, and more importantly, to integrate climate change into development planning. In the absence of long-term strategies, countries are also building on existing conditions, as many have advanced bottom-up initiatives. So long-term low-emission development strategies will facilitate the matching of bottom-up initiatives with top-down actions. For example, by using legal instruments to facilitate enforcement, accountability, and complementarity. Some countries like Mexico and recently Peru have passed climate change laws. Dominican Republic and some other countries are on the way of this process. So the intention is that, not the intention, but actually the passing of these laws respond to this fact of that many bottom-up activities can really become streamlined in national processes. So long-term low-emission development strategies will facilitate overall planning process and not only reporting. Beyond reporting, this is crucial for NDC implementation. for which capacities need to be enhanced in all levels of government structures. So another important aspect in this process is integration. And why it is important? Integration is crucial to solve institutional fragmentation and to facilitate coordination and institutional collaboration. Integration is important in the implementation of both SDGs and NDCs, as these require the mainstreaming into regional and subnational development plans, as well as articulated policies and planning. Subnational and regional governments have a vital role to play in both the implementation and tracking of SDGs and the NDC. And their efforts, therefore, need to be adequately harmonized with national processes. So long-term leads and integration will also facilitate the national budget planning, which often neglects subnational governments. So specifically on reporting in particular, institutional arrangements that respond to an integrated approach will facilitate the management of data and information from generation to reporting. What does this mean? From generation to reporting. It means that there is a whole cycle here. Someone somewhere needs to generate data, which means someone needs to calculate emissions, measure emissions reductions and adaptation actions, standardize metrics, make projections, establish scenarios, etc. This information needs to be validated, centralized, and made official by a relevant agency. Many countries are already considering engaging the national institutes of statistics for this role. Accurate and official data, it is then used for reporting international obligations. Nationally accurate and official data will support long-term planning and facilitate informed decision and policy making. So it is important to engage relevant existing national and subnational institutions in this process by giving them specific roles. This, of course, implies resources and technical capacities. That is why it is important to train permanent sector experts within institutions to secure continuity and institutional memory. It is also crucial the allocation of dedicated resources in the national budgets. In most CBIT country proposals, all these aspects are already considered. A number of countries, for instance, have included in their proposals a revision of their legal frameworks to formalize data collection and management processes. Many countries also mention the establishment of an interministerial coordination units to increase the coordination and communication between ministries and agencies, and to involve stakeholder participation from academia to private sector and civil society. A good transparency system will track implementation and apply lessons learned, and thus enhancing analytical capacity and the understanding of which policies and actions work best and why. So a last point I would like to make is that it is crucial that capacity building support builds on previous efforts and initiatives in a given country to draw on their lessons learned and good practices for a more effective and tailored implementation of the support. This also includes the coordination with ongoing projects and initiatives in the country to avoid overlaps and, if possible, to create synergies. So to summarize, the required capacity for NDC implementation and tracking of progress relate to a set of issues. First of all, as I mentioned, launch an integrated governance process, integrate the NDC goals into sectoral and cross-sectoral actions, train relevant government agency staff, engage and seek for inputs for subnational agencies and consult relevant stakeholders throughout the entire process. Countries need the competence to conduct and review their legal and regulatory frameworks as well. And hopefully all this process will end with facilitating that countries can report with existing official, accurate and reliable data. So efforts that are being done to fight climate change can be effective. I think I will leave there for.
Thank you. I think what you've demonstrated is a huge challenge for the countries. It's a huge investment, and it's really important that if the capacity is built, that the resulting capacity helps the country itself and not only generates nice reports to an outside audience. I think this is really a very important message from you as well. Now I'm asking our moderators here, do we have time for Q&A, or should we actually go into the breakout groups and do the Q&A in the big breakout groups? Okay. Okay, let's open the floor for a few questions to the panelists. I see one there, one there. So let's start. We have three now. So the gentleman who raised his hand first, please.
Okay, thank you, moderator, and thank you for the panelists. It was excellent and inspiring. I just wanted to share our experiences from Ethiopia. I agree with my Indonesian colleague. Institutional aspects are very crucial. So in our case, we have an inter-ministerial steering committee headed by our Prime Minister. And then we have a management committee which is chaired both by the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Finance and Economic Cooperation, the discussions that we had earlier. And then we have a facilities here, facility climate resilient green economy facility, which is a single window operational facility for finances and technical inputs. So the planning happens from bottom up. So the same structure is not only at the national level, but also at the regional level. Ethiopia has 9 regions, and then at the local level, where we call it as waradas, we have districts. So the planning happens from bottom to top, and then the implementation also goes vice versa. So I think we have one of the strongest institutional aspects, and that brings me to the point that my friend Hindu made. I think she made a generalization that all LDC countries, NDCs are prepared by consultants. I think that's not the case. There could be one or two, but in many of the cases, it is not true. It's factually incorrect. Like I can give you an example from Ethiopia. We took 3 years to prepare our NDC because we first prepared our climate resilient green economy strategy in 2010 and 2011. We took 2 years, and then we had the NDC, which we draw from that strategy, which we took 1.5 years. So total 3.5 years. And so our NDC also reflects, you can, of course, generally speaking, you can allude to the amount of time taken to the real preparation. So I think, you will accept that we have really prepared it. And I am sure that many of our countries do so. But of course, I hear the Hindu say about Chad, but I think, maybe things are changing now. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was a gentleman here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I have to say that, Madam Chair, there is always an honor to have you here, Ambassador Michan. It's always good to work with you, and Russell, of course, and thank you to the colleagues that shared their thoughts with us. I wanted to make some comments. I mean, on behalf of Costa Rica and ILAC, because I mean we couldn't agree more than what you share with us, especially in the issues related to human rights. We, ILAC, and the Environmental Integrity Group presented a submission related to this topic, and we're thankful that our recommendations were taken in place, particularly one of the subtopics that we're discussing in this forum related to to human rights and gender and indigenous people. I wanted to highlight some of the points that were made, especially by Tara, on the need that this forum recognize that human rights is a gap. I mean, that's absolutely important. I think that should be the basis to continue our work, and then we can build, we can build in many, well, in different directions. I mean, after that. However, I mean, as we see it, in order to fill the gap, and you mentioned that, we need to think how. So we have been like discussing with different countries and friends of human rights on the ways of how to do that. And the workshop that I mentioned is, I believe, one of the options that we should consider. There is a particular situation in this convention, and this is particular, but at least myself, I mean, I always share this situation with my colleagues, and is that since it is normal for countries, for delegates to come from different ministries, Ministry for Foreign Affairs and ministries of Environment, the sensibility and the understanding of human rights is different. And I have personally witnessed that in several delegations, several situations also. So that's something, I mean, the idea of the workshop, I think, will be like to bring not only the relevant actors, I mean, in the human rights issues, but this is something that I personally recommend to consider. I mean, the sensibility to the negotiators or the people related to the implementation of the NDCs back home, and people who we want them to be involved with human rights. There is another recommendation that we believe is crucial here, and is the construction of guidelines for human rights and climate change. That, from our point of view, is basic. So that should be, we believe, a priority that in what we should work. In order to do that, Tara also mentioned a possible way, and is the creation of this human rights focal point. This is a thought, an idea that we totally share, and we strongly support that. But why is this focal point important? Well, first, someone mentioned before that we need to connect the dots. We need, in this sense, as we said, since we already have the Gender Action Plan, the platform is going to be operationalized, hopefully pretty soon. And we have all these concerns related to human rights. So we need the support of the Secretariat in order to articulate all these efforts. I mean, particularly the cross-cutting issues related to all these areas of work. Besides, it will be a support for member states, and in supporting the construction or the upgrading of their NDCs. There is a particular recommendation it was Norway, I believe, that said that countries should be, that the idea is that there should exist a guideline a guideline that allows or invites countries to include, in a voluntary basis, in their NDCs, the opportunity to report on how human rights are being respected or are being promoted in the implementation of their NDC. There is, of course, in order to go to the details, but I don't have that capacity, because I think that we need the workshop for that. I mean, to define the detail of work that we need in order to do that. However, and since this idea needs to be developed, I mean, this is something that we believe this focal point should support. Yeah, I think I will stop there.
Thank you. There was one more lady over there. Yes, please. And that's the last question. No, the gentleman over there. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Tungarai. I come from Nepal. My question is with regard to integrating human rights, gender responsiveness, and indigenous people's rights in NDCs. I think my question goes to Tara or any of the panelists. Is there any country NDCs which has indicator that has that can, that can show how the human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples and gender responsiveness been addressed. If it has not been that much detailed work, I think it should have been one of the issues we should talk about, because it also links with the tracking of the reporting of the NDC implementation, because the basis of tracking those implementation is Paris Agreement and the COP decision, whereas the COP decision recognized indigenous peoples as one of the non-party stakeholders, and the preamble of the Paris Agreement has a reference to the rights of indigenous peoples. So is there any country who submits their NDC with explicit indicator and parameters with regard to human rights, gender, and the rights of indigenous peoples? Thank you.
Thank you. Very quick responses from Tara and Hindu, and I think we really have to finish then.
On this last question, we know that 65 NDCs refer to gender. We know that 24 refer directly to human rights. 19 on indigenous people's rights. Ones that I've read that stick in my mind that are quite more comprehensive in dealing with those issues would be the Mexican NDC, for example, Costa Rica, I think as well. So there are some examples of good practice. So yes, certainly it's worth looking at some of the NDCs to see how those can be emulated. But as we know, many of the NDCs, they're quite high level. So really it's very important for the next stage of translating the NDC into actions through all of the different sectoral policies and programs of a country. That's where really it's going to be most important to reflect on how these issues can inform action. And what we know is there's even just around the basics of how procedural rights like access to information and participatory rights can be so transformational, and how climate action is conducted. I can only agree with the points from William from Costa Rica. I think those were all really helpful comments and advice. Hindu, did you want to add?
Just a minute to say that we need into the Paris Agreement guideline to integrate these cross-cutting issues, and that can help to better implement in the capacity building the 3 cross-cutting issues. And then totally agree with your propositions that we need the guideline on the human rights, indigenous people's rights, and gender to get them integrated. Thank you.
Well, now the only thing that remains for me is to ask for a big hand to the good panel. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ari. Thank you for the panel. And as they walk off, another round of applause. Thanks. And also to Ari for facilitating. So I think, so you've heard a lot from up the stage here. So now it's everybody's turn to talk. And so we're now going to break into the smaller groups. There are going to be 3 groups, 1 for each topic. And we're going to take 30 minutes to have breakout discussions. So just looking at the clock over here on the wall, we'll go through to 16:45 before we regroup to hear from our moderators. So we've got 3 whiteboards in each corner with the 3 questions. And just quickly, the guiding questions for group 1 are going to be how can internationally supported NDC implementation programs best assist developing countries in strengthening their strategic capabilities, and how can participatory approaches and long-term engagement be introduced to ensure ownership of processes and outcomes. Guiding questions for number 2 on cross-cutting issues, the experience of developing countries and all countries, I would say, with regard to assessing capacity building needs and gaps related to the integration of cross-cutting issues such as gender, human rights, and indigenous peoples. And then group 3, looking at tracking and reporting, what are the specific types of capacity gaps countries are facing with regard to the tracking and reporting of NDC implementation.
So of course, the questions available on the webpage, and they are stuck up on the wall next to each of the boards. So I encourage you to spread out evenly amongst the 3 questions so that we've got best participation and a good sharing of ideas equally across the group.
Yes, thank you, Russell. And then for each of the groups, we will have one member. We have different moderators. And for the first group, we have Matti Numelin from the PCCB. From breakout group 2, we have Benjamin Schachter from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And for breakout group 3, we will have Michael Comstock from UNDP, and they will meet at the corners where it has already been mentioned by Russell, which is 1, 2, and 3.
So number 1 is in this corner.
Okay, 1 is that corner,
2 over there.
2 over there, and 3 here. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Let's get hands on.